This is The White Man's Burden, a most famous piece of colonial propaganda by a most successful colonial propagandist, Rudyard Kipling. This poem aptly surmises European education and propaganda of the day, that of a civilizing mission set to save the world from savagery. This propaganda was vehemently and effectively sold to Indians as well. And this Eurocentric mindset is prevalent in every modern society on some level or another, with few exceptions. In 2016, Shashi Tharoor published An Era of Darkness. In it, he explains with sources the various ways in which the British damaged India. The book had quite the impression on me, to say the least, and led me to continue delving further into the effects of India's colonization on the wider world. Many Indians today believe that British rule had a balanced effect on India, with some pros and some cons. Some even believe this period to have been wholly positive. By far, one of the largest factors in the Indian psyche that contributes to this notion is the British construction of the Indian railways. The first commercial train journey ran in 1853 from Bombay to Thane. From this year onwards, thousands of kilometers of railways were built within decades. The country did become more connected, and many Indian and British colonial sympathizers believe that this is a prime reason advocating the positive side of British rule in India. This, of course, ignores the fact that various other nations built railways without needing to be colonized by England first. In reality, from the onset, the railways were one of British India's largest colonial scams. The British government guaranteed a 5% annual return for anyone investing in the Indian railways, more than any other guaranteed investment of the time. This means that for a British private company building the railways, the more money they spent per mile of tracks, the more money they were guaranteed to receive in return. For this reason, a mile of Indian railways cost £18,000, whereas the same mile in America cost only $2,000. This was no problem for the British government to pay, of course, for the bloated £16,000 difference and an extra 5% was conveniently extracted from the Indian taxpayer's pocket. In the 20 years leading up to the 1870s, the Indian railways received a fifth of all British portfolio investment. It was the Wolf of Wall Street in the City of London, except on a civilizational scale. From this point on, Britain's steel industry, its rail and engine manufacturers, its factories and engineers all found a playground to sell their goods and hone their skills with guaranteed returns. The looting of India funded the technological growth of England. The primary goal of the railways was to ship raw materials such as coal, iron ore, cotton, and grain to the Indian coast, from where they could be transported to England and fed into the industrial machine. Any transport of people was merely incidental. The horrific third-class compartments, created for the average Indian, attracted the ire of the British Legislative Assembly. So bad were the conditions in third-class railway lines that Mahatma Gandhi traveled only on third class to make a point to the British government and to the Indian rich. This is not to mention that third-class passengers contributed handsomely to the profits of British railways, for they had little choice. Indeed, the ticket fare for passengers was deliberately high to subsidize the transport of raw materials out of the country. As Will Durant points out, the greatest revenue comes from third-class passengers. These passengers are herded into almost barren coaches like animals bound for the slaughter. Sounds familiar? Should we accept all of the above as true, the case can still be made that the British transferred railway-making skills to Indians. After all, India today runs one of the most extensive railway lines on Earth. Unfortunately, even this is untrue. Only Europeans were hired to work on the railways, men whose salaries were paid absorbently. The British argued that Indians were not racially fit enough to man the railways. When the Royal Indian Engineering College was established in England in 1872 to train railway engineers for India, Greek, Latin, German, English literature, and English history became prerequisites for joining. These were obviously and deliberately placed to exclude Indians and include Europeans, and it worked. Of the 1,015 engineers in the Public Works Department in 1886, only 86 were Indian. Despite this, the Indians of the day showed their mechanical and engineering prowess in other ways, without the help of the British. In 1878, Indian mechanics at the railway workshops in Jamalpur and Ajmer became so good at their work that they started designing and building their own locomotives. They continued this way for decades, until their work frightened the British, who were perfectly happy to continue importing the more expensive locomotives from England to India. In 1912, the British passed an Act of Parliament banning any production of locomotives in India. Between 1854 and 1947, India imported 14,400 locomotives from England, 10% of all British locomotive production. India imported another 3,000 locomotives from Canada, the US, and Germany. One could still argue that the railways at least enabled the cheaper transport of goods around India. However, even this is not the case. Whereas before the railways, surplus food stock could be sent via waterways to areas in need of food, the railways enabled British authorities to ship away any surplus food from the heart of India, leaving the country with increases in rice prices and occasionally famines. Other examples further make the points above, and the list does go on, but I think by now we're all on the same page. The Indian railways played a large part in the greatest looting in the history of the world. While it is true that Indians inherited the railways after independence, we paid too heavy a price for them, and worked hard to bring their standards up using the scarce resources we had left. Recent findings by the renowned economist Utsa Patnaik pin the total amount extracted from India at 45 trillion US dollars. To put that in perspective, that's 900,000 times the amount that England paid India as reparations in 2018. And even now, there is political pressure in England to stop even these measly payments. Now, this is not to say that Indians of the time were unaware of what was happening. The newspaper Samachar from Bengal, as far back as 1884, claimed that iron roads mean iron chains, but for whatever reason, the population of India was complacent with what was happening. This video is not to say that we should hate the British, for that would be pointless. If anyone, it is the Indians of the day that deserve the most criticism. While I may have the advantage of hindsight, I am comfortable saying that had they been more suspicious of foreign intent and less cooperative, it's unlikely that the Indian railways would have caused the damage that they did. For example, the Chinese actively dismantled railways built by Europeans, for the Qing government had seen the railways as a threat. Now, the past is the past, but we can change our attitudes today. It is only through our history that we can understand our trajectory. For example, Indians are heavily ideologically influenced by English media's cultural zeitgeist, while China has its own search engines and social media. Partly due to this, the Indian attitude towards colonization often aligns with that of an Englishman, who is to this day not taught in any detail about the horrors of colonization in school. The Chinese, however, view that time period tragically as China's century of humiliation, and rightly so. With this in mind, us Indians of the 21st century can learn to avoid being pulled into the Western grand narrative, which began with the looting of our people. We can create a grand narrative of our own instead. Do check out our video on economics to see how we can implement this in our day-to-day lives. Over the next few videos, we'll look into some of the other important misconceptions in the Indian psyche. I'm your host Aashrit. Thanks for tuning in to Dharma Dhaba.